I'm Harold Fricker from the GISC RSC South East. I'll introduce you to the panel. On the far side, Pauline Randall from Virtually, David Burden from Dayton, Alan Cann from the University of Leicester, and Evan Dickerson from the GISC RSC London. We've got 20 minutes, so I'll keep this rather short. What I'd like to do is go straight away to one of the last tweets on my Twitter feed, identifying the K0 report on virtual worlds 2010 and beyond, where it identified the growth of virtual worlds from about 150 to 300 plus within the next few years. And I'd like to fire the first question to my colleague, Alan. In terms of pedagogy within HE, what are the benefits for the learner?
Well, as I think is probably widely known, I've been quite critical of Second Life. I don't think that's a secret. I'm not, as I've said widely, against virtual worlds per se. It is particularly Second Life I've got a problem with. I'm one of the people that Lindsay just identified that spend most of their time actually teaching students. So I'm not from IT services. I'm one of the people that IT services sends students to when they can't do things. I'm the one who answers the students' questions, or I sit with postgraduate students in a room and I try and assist them using technology. So I'm very much at the sharp end. And I have tried very hard to like Second Life in particular. But I also ask myself, what does Second Life give me that I can't achieve in any other way? And in pedagogical terms, after trying for several years, I'm afraid the answer to that is nothing. I have not been able to find anything that Second Life gives me that I can't achieve in any other way. Now, I do accept, I'm from a life sciences background, I do accept that in other fields there may be arguments to use Second Life, which apply more than in life sciences. But I can't see it in my field. And to be honest, I fail to see the return on investment in Second Life in increasingly harsh economic times for education in general and higher education. I think we need to move to simpler solutions.
Great. There's lots in that first comment. Would somebody like to take it up?
Ooh, where to start? I mean, I think when we're looking at virtual worlds, for a start, what we're increasingly beginning to understand is there is a difference between the virtual world technology and the way in which it is presented to the user. And in fact, more and more, the projects we're involved with, almost everything we do is in Second Life, but it's actually using the Second Life technology to actually then deliver a particular learning aim or a particular training aim or a particular communications aim. Actually, very little of what we now do is, if you like, taking place in the larger Second Life community, which is what a lot of people have problems with in terms of the headlines that they see and things like that. So we're seeing that shift from actually saying everything's got to take place within these sort of big social virtual worlds to saying actually the virtual world technology itself is something that we can just pick up and then begin to apply to meeting or to creating a particular learning environment. And I think the other thing we're finding is there's probably three main ways in which this virtual worlds technology itself can be deployed. The first one is actually using it just as a way of breaking a barrier of distance. So just as using it to support remote learning or distance learning. And I think probably 50% or so of the current sort of educational projects within Second Life probably fall into that camp. And really, in a lot of cases there, they aren't offering anything more than you could do possibly through other means. It's just because you're doing it because of distance. The second thing, I think, is where people begin to use it for simulation. And that's the one I think that we found has been most successful so far. So the work we've done on things like sort of training paramedics, we've just done some stuff around customer services. We're actually creating a complete simulation environment. And there, one of the things the students quite like is the fact that they can get access to that environment, into that simulation outside of class time. And they realise it's not something that the university can make available to them 24/7, but if it's in a virtual world, they can get access to that space 24/7. And in terms of ROI, that's one of the areas where there is ROI, because actually setting these things up in the physical world can be very expensive. Whereas to actually do it in the virtual world and make it available over a prolonged period is actually a relatively cheap thing to do. The third area is actually where you begin to do stuff in virtual worlds which you cannot do in any other way. And quite honestly, I'd say that is where we are barely scratching the surface of thinking about really imaginative ways in which we can use these environments.
Can I come back against that, actually? Yeah. Just thinking about virtual worlds in terms of the disciplines of the higher education institutions I support, I should say before I begin, actually, I'm rather playing devil's advocate here on the panel. But, you know, coming from a very kind of creative background with a lot of disciplines that are either design-focused or music-focused or something like that, you know, where collaboration face-to-face plays so much a part of a student's development, a student's ongoing process of their educational process. That's really something that, you know, they would entirely miss in a virtual environment. Coming back to your point about, you know, developing something in Second Life where, you know, you're undergoing a medical procedure. A couple of years ago, I had to undergo quite a tricky eye operation. And just before I was wheeled into theatre, the surgeon came in to see me, and the last thing I remember her saying was, "Don't worry, I've done plenty of these before in real life." Now, that was quite reassuring. You know, what I wouldn't have liked was somebody to come in and go, "Well, don't worry, you know, I flunked it the first 5 times in Second Life, but once I'd revived the patient again, then I got it on the 6th attempt." You know, that wouldn't have been terribly, you know, that was not what I wanted.
You're probably quite happy to fly in an aircraft where actually the pilot has actually had almost all of his training in a simulator, and the first time he lands it for real.
Well,
depends on the simulator.
It depends on the simulator. Exactly.
I mean, I think what's happening is you're finding that you can use virtual worlds for simulations like that, which allow people additional practice so they couldn't get in real life. You know, maybe there aren't enough times that you can practice that, but if you're going back to your surgeon analogy, if they've actually done it several times in a virtual environment and they've, you know, killed the patient several times, but they've resuscitated them, so we're fine, okay with that, then they've actually got a much better baseline to come to when they actually start practicing on real people. And maybe the fall down rate by the time they get to real people is going to be much, much lower because they've become much more familiar with the processes along the way. So it's allowed them to practice the basics of it in a very safe environment.
Yeah, but basics in theory, you know, we all know that things operate in a certain way in theory, but in reality...
We're not saying take away the practice, the real ones, we're just saying this is a good place to start from. You know, like the airline pilot, you know, I mean, it's much cheaper, much more cost-effective to do them on simulations than to keep taking them up and having to have airtime. And you can probably run far more through that process than you could do by using real situations, if by adding simulations into it as well as the real. We're not proposing that you take one away and it's either or.
Excellent. I think that really sets the scene really well. But we've only scratched the surface. Now, I've asked the panel, and what we all of us agree is that we'd like to hear your questions. So, who would like to fire away? There at the back. Just a second. Let the microphone reach you, then we can record you as well. You never know.
It was just a quick point that I think building those simulations is cheaper and quicker using Second Life than it would be otherwise. That's just an observation.
I mean, certainly, in terms of sort of the bang for your buck, that's why we tend to do most of our work in the Second Life platform, is we think we can just do things far faster in that environment than we can do in any other. And it's interesting to see even things like sort of the US Department of Defense that's got oodles of money available to it is increasingly looking to some of these more consumer-orientated platforms for their development instead of some of the more traditional ones.
Mm-hmm. I can't agree with that. I can't agree that building a simulation that will have a practical effect for training a surgeon is cheaper or quicker in Second Life.
I'm not talking about surgery at all, and there's a whole separate class of simulation for doing surgery training. What we're talking about is other sorts of simulation.
I can't accept that it's cheaper or quicker than other solutions, such as showing people photographs training with actors. I don't think there's any evidence that that's the case. There's lots of claims being made about how efficient, how cheap it is. I don't think there's any evidence.
There was an interesting piece of work that's presented by Imperial College at, I think it was at Relive last year, where what they did is they do, at the beginning of each of the medical courses, they actually do a operating theatre familiarisation for the medical students. And what they did last year was they split the students into 3 groups. One group had the traditional familiarisation, which was photos and lecture-based material. The second group they actually took into the operating theatre. The third group they took into Second Life, into a simulation of the operating theatre. And then in the studies they did at the end of that, in terms of the student retention and the student knowledge and how comfortable the students were with their knowledge of the operating theatre, surprisingly, the Second Life students not only scored better than the people who'd had the lecture, they actually scored better than the people who'd actually been into the operating theatre itself. And talking to them, what they put it down to is the people who went into the operating theatre were basically too afraid to touch anything. Whereas actually in Second Life, they felt they could actually sort of push their boundaries a bit. So there's certainly some evidence.
Let's take... Sorry, just to add on the cost side. The other thing to go with that is, of course, once you've actually built that simulation, I'm not saying this, you might need to do changes in the future, but it's infinitely reusable. You know, I mean, if you've got photographs, you've got role plays with people, you can't keep those people there 24/7 just so that you want to role play something again, whereas a simulation, you go there at 2 in the morning, go in and do it.
Well, unless the technology changes, of course, or unless different instruments come into play, and an academic then has no way of updating that, because if they're not skilled enough to script their own tools and environments in Second Life, most of the work that's being done is contracted out to companies.
I mean, that's why under the GIST project that we did for preview for St George's, what we developed is this system called Pivot, that's now royalty-free, open source bit of software. And the whole point of that was to address precisely this issue, which is if you're a domain expert, you don't want to go into Second Life and have to understand how to build in it and script in it and create note cards in it. So instead what you do with Pivot is all of that is done on the web. So if you can use a web application, you go onto the web, you create the structure, you create all the non-3-dimensional content, you get your e-learning people to create whatever 3D objects you want for the scenario, but then you can completely manage and maintain that training scenario through the web and not through the virtual world. So I think moving to those sorts of tools, we're actually saying let's put the intelligence of what it is we're trying to do in the virtual world for any sort of education. Let's bring that intelligence out of the virtual world, put it on the web. That then gives us a lot of flexibility, because it means not only can non-trained staff use it, but actually we can deploy that same exercise into different virtual worlds. So we could have it running in Second Life, in OpenSim, in Metaverse or anything else. And we can also put it onto the web and onto mobile phones.
That's great. Let's take another question.
Hi, it's Graham McAlooney from the University of Sheffield. Now, I think there's a whole lot of discussions that could be had about using something like Second Life for simulations. There's questions of authenticity, congruence with the real world, and I think we could spend an entire conference on this. There are many subjects, or quite a few subjects, that some of us study where we encounter ideas that aren't readily observable in the real world, in real life. I'm an archaeologist by discipline, and I teach students about monumental architecture. We can't see these things in their real states. There's only a few places like Stonehenge or Avery that even remotely look like what they would have done. What's very important is for students to be able to encounter the spatial configurations of places like these and actually enter into debate with them. Now, I'm not an actual user of Second Life as a branded technology, but for me, there's a very clear mandate and a very clear role for this kind of technology and that kind of education.
Pauline, would you like to take that up?
I think St Andrews University have done, I think it was in Second Life, I couldn't confirm that one, but they actually rebuilt an old, I think it was Basilica, that they were doing an architectural dig of in Turkey. And they could then actually create the environment as it would have been and allow, because it's an immersive environment, they could go in there and start to work out how it would have been used and get a much better understanding of the space than they would have been able to do otherwise by just looking at drawings and things.
One of the biggest projects like that was the Theatron project, which was funded, was that EduServe, maybe EduServe funded, with King's College and Coventry University, where what they did was actually build about a dozen historical theatres. So all theatres which are only known from their archaeological records, so as to actually give theatre studies students a far better understanding of actually how the theatre actually worked as a performance space, how people got onto stage, how people got off to stage, what sort of perspectives the audience had. So that's a good example of being used in that way.
Shall we take another question?
Can I come in? Going back to the simulations, I mean, one of the major sort of things that is actually missing out of virtual worlds is the sense of touch. And I think that there's technology out there now. A lot of research has been done, and I think that we're getting to a stage where that's going to be introduced into virtual worlds, and it's then going to have a much bigger impact, talking about simulations, because we can then start building up tacit knowledge for people like who are maybe doing operations or needing actually to understand navigation. If there's an emergency training, there's that type of build-up of information. And so I think touch is going to be the next.
So greater immersion and sensorial feedback.
Yeah, I mean, one of my major objections to virtual worlds at the minute is that they are as yet an imperfect technology. That, we do have things that ideally we would like to see in those kind of environments that are missing, and touch and sensory observation is one of them. There would be no point in trying to take a sculpture student and teach them how to chip a block of marble in Second Life. I mean, there is no other substitute for actually learning how to do that kind of thing, actually other than put chisel to marble and see how it fragments and learn. Simply by doing it, that is the only way to do it. But I mean, touch is one of the key things that's missing, I think.
That probably brings us to the point that, virtual worlds, Second Life, whichever one it is you happen to use, they're not a perfect tool. I don't know what a perfect technology is. But then the other thing is that it's not always, there isn't a single technology that answers all the questions and the needs of everything. And it doesn't matter what you're doing, what you're teaching, what you're working with, it's finding the appropriate tool, the most appropriate tool to use. And sometimes that will be a virtual world that can offer a better choice. Sometimes it will be a whiteboard that will do that. And I think you've got to take the right one at the right time and make the most of that, not try and use one for everything.
Good point. Shall we take...
Where's Jason? Is Jason in the audience? No? Is he a remote participant? I'm led to believe, that I've got no personal experience of this, that there are already sensory input devices available for Second Life. I believe the porn industry produced those several years ago. I think they're widely on the market if you search around the darker corners of the internet.
Another question?
Probably got time for one last question before we go through the drinks. We can always pick it up again in the drinks area. So I think just... So I did see a hand, but then I missed it. Where was it again, sorry? Oh, there we go.
Okay.
I'll come around the back.
A criticism of virtual worlds like Second Life is that they require quite often increased competencies from the average user. So there is a barrier to accessibility to this kind of tools. Also, they require quite a lot of competencies which do not serve in anything else to the users, where they try to transfer the skills they acquired in Second Life or in other virtual worlds to the real situation. What does the panel think about that?
Great.
Well, I think one of the key things, as you said, is that, quite often people don't have the necessary skills, and a lot of people's initial time and experience can be spent going off down a side alley of actually picking up those skills, and you go down a dead end in terms of being drawn away from your intended learning outcomes or your intended learning scenario away from that towards going to actually pick up the skills that you require to just find your way around the world.
If we always treated it that way, we'd never learn anything new, because nobody would be using computers, because nobody had the skills to use it in the first place. We had to go off down that track to get those skills before we could use it and then exploit it.
I think we're getting a lot better now understanding what we need to teach students before they go into these environments. I think probably one of the best things we ever did with clients was to stop anybody using the Second Life orientation area. And instead what we do is basically a student can sign up on the university's own site, they then go straight into a tuned orientation space that shows them exactly what they need to know for that particular exercise, and then they're into the environment. And we've done a project recently with University for Industry, where we were dealing with students which were entry-level, was it entry-level 2, entry-level 3 English reading and writing. So these are people who are struggling to get conventional sort of qualifications even. But actually by having a very tuned, very optimized induction into the virtual world and not actually presenting it as Second Life, just saying this is a training exercise, we actually found they took to it far better than people who are saying, oh, we're going to go into this very spooky thing called Second Life and you need lots and lots of familiarization. And by the way, get your own way in and go to the Second Life Orientation Island and all that. So I think we're getting a lot smarter over the last couple of years in terms of how we bring people into these environments. Plus, going back to your very original point, if we've got 300 plus virtual worlds coming on, most of those are actually teenage and preteen virtual worlds, so the generation that's now coming through is going to be far more familiar with these environments than the current generation.
Mm-hmm. So someone asked just now what a perfect technology is. I venture to hazard a definition. Perfect technology is one which is accessible to the highest number of people. It's one which isn't exclusive. It's one which isn't Western-centric and doesn't disenfranchise most of the world from using it because they don't have the resource or the bandwidth to using it. And it's one which doesn't de-skill academics. And Second Life does all of those things, so it's not a perfect technology.
Do you have an example of a perfect technology, though?
No, but I can tell you that Second Life isn't one. I would say that Twitter meets those criteria better than Second Life. Possibly even Facebook meets those criteria better than Second Life.
Excellent. I may have to